A planet doomed to disaster. Desperate scientists. Last hope. A kind couple. Superman. With these lines begins one of the greatest stories ever written. One of the most iconic DC comics about Superman. And it's very rare that a single story manages to capture the essence of a character that has changed so much over the years. All-Star Superman is a comic that pays homage to the great stories of the past but takes the man of tomorrow into the future, updating his philosophy and demonstrating that the concept of the Superman is one that is far from being obsolete. An epic pop culture odyssey that begins with the destruction of a super advanced planet and ends a million years in the future, when this baby who was sent to Earth through the River of Destiny becomes the greatest hero the universe has ever known. This is likely the definitive story of Superman, and that's why talking about All-Star Superman is so complicated. On one hand, it's a story that anyone can enjoy without worrying about comic continuity, but at the same time, it has extremely specific references and symbolism that can only be understood if you know the history of DC Comics very well, and above all, what writer Grant Morrison thinks about the character and how he came to write this story. In this video, we'll thoroughly analyze this comic to uncover its secrets and the message Grant Morrison aimed to convey through his greatest work. I'm Go! The Geek Monitor. After 7 years, it's time to take All-Star Superman very seriously.
I, the Geek Monitor.
Chapter 1. Superman, a hero who transcends reality. Believe it or not, All-Star Superman begins with the story behind the creation of this cover, in which we see the Man of Steel sitting on the clouds over Metropolis. I remember many years ago when I bought this comic and saw the cover for the first time, it seemed to me something extremely peculiar, far from the typical cover of superhero comics, but there is a reason for this. In his book Super Gods, which is a kind of autobiography mixed with the history of superheroes, Grant Morrison tells that in 1999, DC Comics approached him and other great writers like Mark Waid and Mark Miller to tell them about a project called Superman Now, which aimed to introduce Superman to a new generation of readers. Morrison had already written Superman stories in the past, particularly those he did in his Justice League run. However, this project made him start to think, what makes Superman so special? Morrison says he thought a lot about this topic and couldn't seem to find the answer, but something almost magical happened to him one night after a comic convention he attended. Morrison and his editor were near their hotel when they ran into a person who, in his words, was Superman. He wore a perfect red and blue suit. His hair had a characteristic curl and he certainly had the physique of a Superman. Upon seeing him, Morrison approached him and asked if he could do a small interview with him. The mysterious man agreed and answered each question without breaking character. The interview, according to Morrison, lasted an hour and a half and gave him so many ideas that he spent the entire night writing sketches and ideas about the Man of Steel, the Superman. Now project never happened, but these ideas ended up in All-Star Superman. What does this have to do with the cover? Well, Morrison said that this mysterious man sat this way for the interview. His pose was very relaxed, like an invincible man who doesn't have to prove anything, just the way Superman would have sat, according to Morrison. We can also see that he seems to be looking directly at us, as if he were able to break through this membrane between fiction and reality, just like this mysterious man. In his autobiography, Grant Morrison says that he chooses to think that Superman literally appeared to him as if it were, in his words, a pop shamanic vision. And this is a very important point to understand All-Star Superman, that Morrison sees the Man of Steel as such a powerful figure that he is capable of transcending reality. This event inspired him to create a project that would be, in his words, the pinnacle of my career, a way to put all my thoughts about superheroes into one piece. The idea was to deal through a comic with Superman's mortality, show his last days and the 12 heroic labors he would do before dying for the benefit of humanity. Chapter 2. A classic story of the Man of Steel. The first issue of All-Star Superman begins by telling a typical Superman story in which Lex Luthor attacks a human expedition on the sun, with the Man of Steel arriving just in time to thwart his plans. Beyond this, from the first pages, the story tells us the tone of the universe whose story we are seeing. For example, they show us Lex Luthor as a man so intelligent and so dangerous that he is capable of having two simultaneous conversations, one in real time and another with a 9-minute difference, which is the time it takes for his message to reach the sun. They also tell us that humanity has been deceived many times by him, but that the Daily Planet is about to unmask him once and for all. Another very interesting point is that we see Lois Lane writing the headline "Superman saves the first human crew in the sun" before he does it. In fact, she even mentions to Steve Lombard that she always writes Superman's headlines beforehand, which tells us about a universe where the Man of Steel has never failed and has all the confidence in the world. This first issue then presents us with the most classic Superman story in the most classic universe. He always saves the day as if nothing could go wrong. And once he presents this, Morrison introduces the plot twist. Before the monster commanded by Luthor could explode, Superman saves the crew of the sun through a new power, with which he extends his own bioelectric field to protect and save the ship. When this happens, Professor Leo Quintum, the scientist in charge of leading the mission to the sun, after several tests, it's determined that Superman's powers have dramatically increased. Overexposure to the sun, the source of his powers, has made his cells unable to process so much energy, which leaves Kal-El with only a few months to live, in which he will have to put his affairs in order before leaving. This part of the story is inspired by a fragment of Grant Morrison's real life, who, around that time, had just lost his father to cancer. He said the idea of a more powerful Superman is very interesting. Because regularly one of the biggest criticisms towards the character is that he is too strong, and many writers tried to limit his power through arguments like weakness to kryptonite, magic, etc. But Morrison in this comic seems to tell us that when you write a character as powerful as Superman, the interesting thing is to find out how his immense power can work within the story. Not to limit him, because half of infinity is still infinity. Finally, in this first issue, we also see this classic version of Clark Kent, who stumbles to get to the offices of the Daily Planet or bumps into a passerby to save him without him realizing it. And seeing Clark in this clumsy way is very important in this story, because for Morrison, Clark Kent is the transcendental element in the Superman equation. That is, at some point in our lives we have all identified with him. He is the character that makes us think that we all harbor a great power within us, one that almost no one notices. On the other hand, this Clark is necessary within the story because no one in his universe would believe that this person, so far removed from what Superman is secretly the Man of Steel. This issue ends with Superman revealing his secret identity to Lois. The first comic then presents us with all these classic concepts that are developed in later issues, but the following issues pay tribute to a very specific stage of Superman's career. Some readers of the All-Star Superman comic and viewers of its animated adaptation have expressed that certain elements feel out of place, particularly in the latter part of the story. However, there is a reason for this. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the comic have that Silver Age feeling of Superman stories. Comics immersed in science fiction that each week posed an unreal concept but extremely entertaining and mysterious. For example, in Chapter 2, Superman invites Lois to a dinner at his Fortress of Solitude and shows her the key he uses to open it, some sections of his zoo of fantastic creatures, and how his robots manage the whole place, concepts that derive from the Superman comic 187 from 1966. Lois also sees how this fortress contains miraculous machines like the one Superman uses to contact the future and a formula that gives him superpowers, concepts that also derive from these classic stories. These comics not only pay tribute to these concepts that were formerly used in the Silver Age, but also to certain cliches. One of them is seeing Lois Lane as this reporter obsessed with knowing Superman's secret identity, while at the same time not believing that it is Clark Kent. We also see in Chapter 4, Jimmy Olsen living a series of fantastic adventures in which he transforms into exotic creatures and characters that seemingly come out of nowhere, like Samson and Atlas, who suddenly appear to challenge the Man of Steel to a series of tests and the reptilian community that lives in the center of the earth. All these concepts seem to come out of nowhere because that's how the stories were back then. The audience simply had to accept that Samson or the reptilians existed in this world, and that's it, without further explanation. these kinds of stories had a certain charm. Morrison also introduces highly complex concepts within these simple stories. One of them is when the Ultra Sphinx appears, takes Louis prisoner, and asks Superman to answer the question.
Unanswerable. Lois, no! Stop Superman. She now exists. In a state of quantum uncertainty. She is neither alive nor dead. Answer correctly, and it will be life. Fail, and the consequence will be death. State your question. What happens when the unstoppable force meets the immovable object?
Superman then takes a pause and finally says, both give way. Acceptable answer. At this point, Morrison used the structure of a simple Superman story to talk to us about quantum physics topics. The curious thing is that the answer Superman gives is correct. According to Javier Santolala from the Dayton Vlog channel, these stories portray Superman as not only omnipotent, but also extremely wise, and I agree with him. But since we're talking about the good side of the story, it's time to go to the evil side. Chapter 3. The Man of Tomorrow and his relationship with evil. In Chapter 5, titled The Gospel According to Lex Luthor, Lex is sentenced to die in the electric chair for his crimes against humanity. When he is in prison, Clark Kent comes to visit him for an interview. His intention is to discover why the world's smartest man uses all his resources with the intention of destroying Superman instead of using them to save humanity. During this visit, Lex asks Clark some very interesting questions. He questions if Superman's presence alone diminishes his existence as a human. He asks if he thinks that maybe Lois Lane would have noticed him if it weren't for Superman, and mentions that he feels it's unfair that this alien has power simply by existing. Something very interesting is that, throughout this whole conversation, Lex is exercising letting us understand that for him, the only valid power is the one that is the result of effort and personal merit. Morrison portrays Lex Luthor as an atheist who greatly resents divine figures in this story. This is because he feels that they limit human potential, which personally is my favorite of all the motivations that Lex Luthor has had over time. But despite all his hatred during this prison visit, Clark manages to save Lex several times without him realizing it. This compassion that Superman feels even for his most bitter adversaries we can also see in this other section of the comic where two lost Krypton astronauts, Bar-El and Lilo, impose their culture on Earth in the absence of Superman. It's like seeing what would have happened if another Kryptonian other than Kal-El had come to our world and what he would have done with such power. At the end of this chapter, it is revealed that Bar-El and Lilo suffer from a degenerative disease, and even though moments before they had brutally beaten Superman and enslaved his world, the last son of Krypton did everything possible to alleviate the pain they felt in their last moments and sent them to the Phantom Zone where they could continue living adventures together, vowing to do everything possible to cure them. This suggests that Superman's defining traits are not his abilities or Kryptonian origins, as many other characters in the comics have shared his powers. What makes him the greatest hero of all is his ability to do good. In this comic, Morrison presents us with a Superman who goes far beyond being a superhero. He not only confronts the world's supervillains and super threats, but also seeks to save people in more than one sense and in any situation. For example, while trying to escape from the Bizarro world, a world full of unintelligent creatures that speak in opposites, he manages to give the only intelligent inhabitant of that planet, a character named Shibaro, a reason to live. We also see him when, in the midst of his last months of life, he saves a girl who is about to jump off a building, taking her in his arms and telling her, "It's never as bad as it seems. You're much stronger than you think you are." In these months, while preparing for his death, he also takes the miniature doctors of Kandor to hospitals to cure diseases like cancer, and even creates a miniature universe within his Fortress of Solitude to analyze what a world without a Superman would be like. This is when the comic enters the realm of meta stories, which is one of the strongest points in Grant Morrison's stories, because this universe that Superman created is ours. In Chapter 10, Superman does everything he can to make the most of his final moments. He saves lives on a train, defeats an evil scientist, fixes the last of the world's bridges, and even visits Lex Luthor in his cell with the intention of giving him a second chance. While this is happening, the universe that Superman built exhales life and advances thousands of years in just a few seconds. In a millisecond, we see natives making cave paintings, then Greek philosophers preaching about the existence of God, then Nietzsche developing his theory of the Superman, and finally, young Joe Shuster in Cleveland sketching his new character Superman, which gives us this feeling of being part of history, like the feeling of seeing a mirror within a mirror within a mirror. This concept that Superman created our world is one of the most acclaimed in this story, because it precisely talks about Superman as this divine figure capable even of creating life and a whole culture. But I think my favorite point of this comic is the way it deals with the future of Superman, that is, the legacy that the Man of Steel leaves. Chapter 4, The Legacy of the Last Son of Krypton. The animated adaptation of All-Star Superman is excellent. However, for obvious reasons, it could not contain all the plot lines of the comic, and the void that is most felt is the one that precisely talks about the legacy of the last son of Krypton, which we see in Chapter 6 of the comic. In this issue, 3 mysterious individuals arrive to work at the Kent farm when Clark still lives in Smallville. As the story progresses, we are told that these 3 characters are descendants of Superman. Among them, there is a Superman with telepathic powers from the year 85,250. Another being from the 5th dimension, like Mr. Mxyzptlk, arrives, along with the mysterious bandaged Superman from the year 4500. They are all members of the Superman Squad, who are responsible for protecting the timeline from threats and are in Smallville to stop a monster known as the Chronovore. When Clark tries to help these other Supermen stop this monster, one of them tries to stop him. Clark doesn't know why, but in the end he manages to help save Smallville. Unfortunately, this Superman from the future reveals that he tried to stop him because these 3 minutes that Clark lost fighting the Chronovore would prevent him from saying goodbye to Jonathan Kent, the father who raised him, who would die of a heart attack in those minutes. At that moment, Clark stopped hearing his father's heartbeat and felt a silence so overwhelming that it almost destroyed him. However, even though this Clark didn't get to say goodbye to Jonathan Kent, it is revealed that the unknown Superman was actually the present Superman who had the opportunity to say goodbye to his father after all these years. In the end, this death was what made him leave Smallville and become part of the world he would eventually protect. We also see that a golden Superman gave him an indestructible flower from the planet Krypton to place on Jonathan Kent's grave. This number is extremely important. First of all, because Clark learns that some things are inevitable. Things had to happen that way to ensure the future. But even when everything looked bad, he manages to turn the situation around and was able to see Jonathan Kent one last time. Another very important point of this part of the story is that it tells us that Superman's legacy does not die with him and links All-Star Superman with another comic that Grant Morrison had written several years ago. The golden Superman who laughs when Clark asks him which descendant he is, and the final ally of the ex-Luthor, a supercomputer named Solaris, also seem to come out of nowhere. However, they first appeared in the Justice League run written by Grant Morrison in a story called Justice League 1 Million. In this comic, the Justice League of the 853rd century travels to the past to meet the League of the present and invite them to witness the second coming of the last son of Krypton. This comic also tells us that the greatest enemy in Superman's history was not Lex Luthor or Brainiac, but this supercomputer called Solaris, who even killed one of Kal-El's descendants. It should be clarified that this story was published in 1998, 7 years before All-Star Superman began to be published. What's going on here? Well, Grant Morrison seems to have a very particular story of Superman in his head, which ends in a very specific way. And everything that Morrison writes about Superman are the adventures that are in between. Everything that happened to get to that other point. This tells us that even though All-Star Superman and Justice League 1 Million are in separate universes, in Morrison's mind they occur in the same universe. Everything is part of this epic story about the birth, life and death of the sun god from the planet Krypton. However, just like the myths of various cultures, his story does not end here, as this myth would not be complete without the part of the resurrection. Lex Luthor finally reveals that his secret ally is Solaris, and Superman, with the energy he has left, decides to go confront him in space. Although he manages to defeat him, the battle completely exhausts the last son of Krypton, who fades away and opens his eyes only to find himself next to his father, Jor-El, on a Krypton planet that apparently never exploded, where Kal-El has lived his entire life with his people. However, Jor-El tells him,
I must tell you something, my son. There's something you need to know. I'm dead, Kal-El. I died when Krypton was destroyed in a huge explosion. I, your mother, our people, everyone is gone.
Father, this is Krypton.
Are you sure you don't have scarlet fever?
You don't understand, my son. You're also dead. You died defending humanity. However, consciousness does not die, Kal-El. After death, studies say that consciousness persists. Your body is becoming a solar consciousness and you must surrender to that process.
Surrender. But if I die, Superman dies. One final task remained, as there always is.
One more task, Kal-El. There's always more work. You showed humans the man of tomorrow, giving them an ideal to strive for. You embody their greatest aspirations. They will follow you, stumbling and falling, but in the end, they will join you in the sun, Kal-El. So the decision here is simple. Surrender to the infinity of the cosmos. Or return to face evil once again.
I think this dialogue between Jor-El and Kal-El is my favorite moment from the comics of all time. My first tattoo was one of those phrases, as I believe it symbolizes Superman's perfection. By this point in the story, he had already given everything to save the world and only needed to surrender to the vastness of the cosmos. But he decides to return and face evil once more even though he doesn't have to. And that tells us a lot about the nature of the character. When Superman returns, he realizes that Lex has found a way to obtain his superpowers and is about to destroy Metropolis. Another key moment in the story arrives. Superman manages to defeat Lex Luthor once and for all by making him feel empathy. It turns out that when Lex obtained Superman's powers, he also gained his ability to see natural forces and human beings in a different way. In other words, for the first time in history, Lex saw things the same way Superman did.
It is so obvious. The fundamental forces are united by consciousness. I can see the machinery of the universe connecting and separating everything since the cosmos began. That's how he sees us all the time, every day. As if it were just us here together and we are everything.
We have. Unfortunately for Lex, after his epiphany, Superman found a way to take away his powers, but he couldn't forget what he saw. I saw how to save the world. I could have made everyone see it. I could have saved the world if it weren't for you. If you had cared, Luthor, you would have saved the world years ago. However, the planet was still not safe, as Solaris had consumed our sun, so Superman had to sacrifice everything once again and distance himself from the people he loves if he wanted to save our world. No one but me can repair the sun, Lois, and I only have moments to save the world.
It's more than you've ever needed.
I will love you, Lois Lane, until the end of time. Superman then flew straight into the sun and released all his energy to reignite it. People think that he died at that moment, but Lois knows the truth. He's up there fixing the sun, and when he's done, he'll return to Earth. Centuries later, the universe and heroes of all time gather in a grand celebration to see the original Superman, the hero who inspired hundreds of generations, return after nearly 1,000,000 years in the sun. The universe decided to give him a gift, and using technology, they brought back the planet Krypton and the love of his life, Lois Lane. He had waited 1,000,000 years to see her, and in his eyes, nothing else mattered at this moment. It was a love so great that it survived time itself. Thus ends the story of the last son of Krypton, the one who brought with him the dreams and hopes of an entire culture. Here I mix the ending of All-Star Superman with the ending of Justice League 1,000,000 because I believe that's how it happens in Morrison's head. This is the story he wants to tell, and in my opinion, it's a perfect ending. For Morrison, All-Star Superman works as an antidote to edgy characters. It's a way to show that fantastic stories about an all-powerful and all-good character also work, and that the concept of Superman is not one that is obsolete, and I think it achieves its purpose perfectly well. Morrison in his story makes us see Superman through his eyes, just as he sees him an ideal to achieve. In his words, our Superman would try to distill the pure essence of the greatest creation of pop culture, show the soul of an indestructible hero, so strong, so noble, and so smart and ingenious that he doesn't need to kill to make his point. There is no problem that Superman cannot solve or overcome. He cannot lose.
He will never let us down because we made him that way.
He dressed up like Clark Kent and endured the world's abuse to remind us that beneath our shirts, waiting, there's always a familiar flash of color, a stylized lightning, a burning heart. And maybe if we see Superman this way, as Jor-El said, maybe in the future we can join him in the sun.